Okay, now to start this, I'm going to use some different colours because it gets a little bit complicated here. So it's all to do with substitution as Pythagoras, and in the end it's solving an equation. So the first thing we're told that the radius is equal to x. So this is clearly the radius there. So I'm just going to say r equals x. Okay. And we're also told that the slant height is equal to x root 5. Now, what does x root 5 mean? Well, it means root 5 times x. Now, root 5 is not a square number, so root 5 is irrational. There's another pattern. If it was root 4, it would just be 2x. Okay, so we're going to leave it as x root 5, which is just root 5 times by x. So we know, I'm going to call this s, slant height. So that's x root 5. And what we need, and we don't currently have, is the height of the cone. Now the height of a cone is perpendicular to its radius. So we've got h, or should we say we don't have h, but we need to know what it is. So if I label this, it's just a 2D representation, then we know that this is h, which is what we want. And we know that this is x. And we know that this is x root 5. Now I suppose it's a little bit confusing, that's h. It's h for height. So it's not the hypotenuse, because we can see there that the hypotenuse is actually x root 5. So I'm just going to make that clear, that h stands for height, not the hypotenuse. So we use Pythagoras to work out h. So we start with, already in red, h squared equals. Now because it is not the hypotenuse, it's a difference between the hypotenuse and the other side. So it's going to be a takeaway. So we've got x root 5. Don't forget that needs to be squared. Minus, and then the shorter side is x, that needs to be squared. Okay. Now, what does x root 5 squared mean? Well, it just means x root 5 times by x root 5. And x times x is x squared. And if you multiply the square root of something by itself, you're in effect, the square root cancels out, and you just end up with that number. Okay. If I just quickly show you, if I did that with root 9 times by root 9, well, root 9 is a square number, so that's obviously 3 times 3, which is equal to 9. So I could generalize and say root a times by root a would be a. So instead of writing that with brackets, I can remove the brackets and write that instead. Now, what we will do is, we normally now it's an integer, put it in front of it. Okay, so we know that h squared is equal to 5x squared minus x squared. Now at this point, it starts to look a bit nicer. And I'm just going to use black now. So we've got 5x squared, take away x squared. Well, that's clearly going to be 4x squared. Okay, so I don't want h squared, want the square root of 4x squared. That will give me h. Okay, well, the square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of x squared is x. So h is just 2x. And if you're not sure about that, think about what happens when you take 2x and multiply it by 2x. You get back to 4x squared. So the key thing is now we know what the height is in terms of x. So if I go back to here, I can write that. Write it in red. So the height is 2x. Therefore, this is what we're trying to get to. We know what the volume is. A third is a third. Pi is a constant. We know what r is in terms of x. And we know what h is in terms of x. So let's substitute into that. So it gives you the formula for volume of a cone, so you don't have to remember that. So 1,000. Let me just rub that out. I'm going to go back to black. Okay, so 1,000 is equal to a third pi. Now, we'll go back to colours for the things we already worked out. R is equal to x, so r squared is just x squared. H was red. So we know that h is 2x. I'm just going to put that in brackets just to remind you that that needs to be multiplied. And then go back, write everything in black now. So 1,000 is equal to a third pi. Now x squared times 2x is going to be 2x cubed. So we only have one unknown, that is x. Pi is not an unknown, pi is a constant. So there's different ways to do this, and I would just, because it's quite complicated, I'm going to do it one step at a time. First thing, I'm going to divide by a third. Now, we know the reciprocal rule. Instead of dividing by a third, we can say that's the same as times it by 3. I do it to both sides, so I get 3,000 equals. Now a third times 3 is 1, so that's the whole point of doing that, is to get rid of that third. So I end up with pi 2x cubed. So next thing I'm going to do, well, 2x cubed has been multiplied by pi, so I'll divide both sides by pi. So on the left hand side I get 3,000 over pi. Notice I haven't used a calculator yet, because 3,000 over pi, if I evaluate that, that's a rational number and I'm going to get a rounding error. Okay, the next thing, well, how do I get rid of times by 2? I divide by 2. If I divide a fraction by 2, it just goes on the denominator. Okay, you can probably guess what I'm going to do here. I'm going to cube root both sides. So it's a cube root of 3,000 over 2 pi. Now, I put that in brackets just to be clear when I'm doing my calculator. And when I evaluate that, I'm just going to write the answer down. 3 significant figures. It's 7.81 centimeters. Now you could check that by substituting it into x here, timesing it by 2 here, and then making sure that when I times that by a third and pi, and I square, so So I don't use this one, I use this one. When I square that, I get 1,000. Now I did check that, and that does give 1,000. If you use 7.81, it's a rounded answer, you'll get close to 1,000. So that's quite a lot of work to get that, but there it is, 7.81 centimeters. Now the next question is not the same, but it's very similar, except instead of the cone, it's a triangular prism. Now that makes it a little bit easier because, well, you don't get given the formula, but the formula is a little bit easier. So remember, the volume of a prism is equal to the cross section. That's the bit when you slice it all the same. So in this case, it's here. So this is x over 2, the height. It's a right angle, and x. Now because those two are perpendicular, one is the base, one is the height. And if you multiply those together, you'd get the area the rectangle takes up. So let's just work out the area of a rectangle first. So that would be x over 2, which is its height, times by x. I'm just going to write it as x over 1. It's easier to multiply the fractions that way. X times x is x squared, and 2 times 1 is 2. Now this is important, that's the area of the rectangle. I want the area of the triangle. So as I previously said, I need to work out half of that, or divided by 2. Whichever way you do that, times by half or divided by 2, what you'll end up with is x squared over 4. So that is the cross-sectional area. So I'm going to start with that. And remember, the volume of a prism is equal to its cross-sectional area times by its height or its length. In this case, we'd call it as a length, just the way it's aligned. And its length is 27x over 2. That's an expression, we can't solve it. But we do know, like the previous question, the volume is equal to 1,000. Okay, so we multiply two fractions together. X squared times 27x is just going to be 27x cubed over 8 is equal to 1,000. So let's go over here. Well, first thing I do is get rid of divide by 8, which is pretty easy. Multiply by 8. So that is equal to 8,000. And next thing I do is I divide by 27. And then the final thing I do is I cube root all of that. So it has to be 8,000 over 27. If you put that on your calculator, you get 20 over 3 centimeters, which is perfectly acceptable as an answer. You could evaluate that and write it as a decimal.